When 7-year-old Noah Cassidy pressed his backpack straps against his chest with both hands at a municipal bus stop on the east side of Tucson on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, and looked up at the largest person within reach, a biker named Gerald Fuse Fuentes, who was waiting for the same bus with his helmet under his arm, and said in a voice so quiet it nearly disappeared into the street noise, "Check my backpack, please, mister." The man's first instinct was to assume the boy needed help with a zipper or had lost something inside and couldn't find it. It was the kind of request that existed in the ordinary frequency of daily life, the small logistical appeals that strangers made to each other in public spaces without consequence or significance. But then Noah said the second part, the part that changed the frequency of everything. "Check it before she gets here," he said. And he cut his eyes to the left, a small, controlled movement, the practiced discretion of a child who had learned to communicate fear without displaying it, toward a woman in a gray cardigan standing 40 feet away at the edge of the bus shelter who was looking at her phone with the studied casualness of someone working hard to appear unconcerned. And Gerald Fuentes, who had spent 11 years as a school resource officer before joining the Sonoran Iron MC, and who had in those 11 years developed a specific and finely calibrated sensitivity to the particular register of fear in children's voices, felt something shift in his chest like a gear catching. He crouched down. He unzipped the backpack, and what he found inside would set off a chain of events that brought 4 police units to that bus stop within 7 minutes, exposed a custody violation that had been operating across 2 states for 11 weeks, and placed Noah Cassidy in the arms of his father before the sun went down on a Wednesday that had begun as the most ordinary kind of day and ended as something else entirely. The Route 12 bus stop on Madera Avenue was not the kind of place people chose to spend time. It was a utilitarian structure, a plastic bench under a fiberglass roof, a posted schedule that was aspirational rather than accurate, a concrete pad that collected cigarette butts and the particular debris of a city in motion. It sat at the intersection of a commercial block and a residential neighborhood, flanked by a pawn shop and a laundromat, across the street from a tire shop whose air compressor ran at irregular intervals and provided the block's dominant percussion. At 3:45 on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, it held the usual population of a city bus stop in the hour after school let out, a retired man with a canvas shopping bag, 2 teenage girls in school uniforms sharing earbuds, a young woman with a stroller, and Gerald Fuentes, waiting for the Route 12 that would take him to his mechanic's shop 3 miles east, where his truck had been sitting since Monday with a transmission problem that was costing him money he didn't currently have. Gerald Fuse Fuentes was 46 years old, a stocky man with a broad face and a neat dark mustache going gray at the edges, and the build of someone who had been strong his whole life and had maintained it with the unshowy consistency of a man who did physical work as a matter of course. He carried his helmet under his left arm because his bike was in the shop too, a separate problem on a separate timeline, and he wore his Sonoran iron vest because he wore it every day the same way other men wore watches, as a matter of identity rather than occasion. The Sonoran Iron MC was a mid-sized club with deep roots in the Tucson community, known for their school supply drives and their work with the Boys and Girls Club and the Veterans Assistance Program they ran out of the East Side Clubhouse on Thursday evenings. Gerald had joined 8 years ago, 2 years after leaving his position as a school resource officer at a middle school in the Sunnyside district, and he had brought with him into the club the particular skill set of a man who had spent a decade and a half learning how children communicated distress and how adults too often failed to receive it. He was looking at his phone when the boy appeared beside him. Not beside him exactly, but close, closer than a stranger's child would typically position themselves to an unknown adult at a bus stop. Close enough that Gerald registered the proximity before he registered the child, a change in the space beside him that drew his attention downward. The boy was 7, maybe 8, small and neat in the way of children whose adults dressed them carefully, dark jeans and a clean white shirt, and a backpack that was new enough to still have the shape of its manufacturing, not yet softened by the daily compression of a school year. His hair was dark and cut short, and his face was composed with the particular effortful composure of someone very young working very hard at it. His eyes were brown, and they were moving in a pattern that Gerald recognized before he consciously identified it, a scanning pattern, checking positions, monitoring a specific point in his peripheral field while trying to appear to be doing something else entirely. "Check my backpack, please, mister." The voice was low, not a whisper, but calibrated, aimed at Gerald and no further. Gerald looked at him. He had learned a long time ago that his first response in these moments mattered more than people understood. The children who had gathered the courage to say the difficult thing were exquisitely sensitive to the quality of the reception it received, and that a wrong first response, a laugh, a dismissal, an adult's reflexive minimizing, could close a door that had taken enormous effort to open. He said, "Sure, buddy," and reached for the backpack with the calm, unhurried movement of someone doing a perfectly ordinary thing. But before his hand reached the zipper, the boy said the second part, "Check it before she gets here," and cut his eyes left. Gerald followed the look without moving his head, using the same peripheral tracking that had served him in school hallways and cafeterias, and the particular charged geography of places where children and adults coexisted with unequal power. The woman in the gray cardigan was 40 feet away, standing at the edge of the bus shelter's shadow. She was looking at her phone, and her posture was the posture of someone who was not looking at her phone, the particular tension in the shoulders and neck of a person whose attention was elsewhere and whose phone was a prop. She was in her early 50s, Gerald assessed, with the careful presentation of someone who had assembled their appearance to communicate normalcy and reliability. A good coat, sensible shoes, hair arranged without extravagance. She looked like someone's mother. She looked like someone's aunt. She was looking at her phone, and she was not looking at it, and she was watching the boy, and Gerald could feel it from 40 feet. He unzipped the backpack. "Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today and what time it is there, because this story is going to show you what it looks like when a child has learned to ask for help in the only way available to them. And we want to know where in the world our community is watching from." We put out a new story every single day on this channel, and every one of those stories starts with someone deciding to pay attention. Inside the backpack was the ordinary inventory of a child's school day: a binder, 2 textbooks, a pencil case, a crumpled permission slip, a water bottle. And tucked into the front pocket where a child would put something they needed to access quickly and reliably, a folded piece of paper and a small photograph. Gerald took out the folded paper first. He opened it. It was a handwritten note, the handwriting small and careful in the way of someone writing under stress, someone who needed the words to be legible and precise because the legibility mattered. It said, "My name is Noah Cassidy. I am 7 years old. My father is Daniel Cassidy. His phone number is written below. I am not supposed to be with the woman who has me. She is my Aunt Linda. There's a court order. Please call my dad. Please help me. I made this note myself." Gerald looked at the photograph. It showed a man in his mid-30s with dark hair and a broad smile, and the same brown eyes as the boy standing next to him now, holding the boy on his shoulders in the way of fathers who had decided that shoulders were the correct unit of transportation for small children, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Gerald looked at Noah. Noah was watching him with the careful steadiness of someone who had planned this moment and was now in it, and needed to know if the plan was working. Gerald said, "How long have you been making this note?" Noah said, 3 weeks. "How many times have you tried to give it to someone?" Noah looked at the woman in the gray cardigan, a brief controlled glance, and then back at Gerald. 6 times, he said, but she was always too close. Gerald's jaw tightened in a way he controlled immediately, because this was not the moment for his own reaction. This was the moment for Noah's. "How long have you been with your aunt?" he said. Noah said, "Since July. She picked me up from school one day. She said Dad said it was okay, but Dad didn't say it was okay. I know because Dad always calls me before anything changes. He always calls me first. She didn't let me call him." Gerald folded the note carefully and put it in his vest pocket, and he stood up and looked at the woman in the gray cardigan, and she looked back at him, and in that exchange of looks across 40 feet of Tucson sidewalk, something was communicated that had no words but was entirely clear. She had seen the backpack open. She had seen the note come out. She was calculating. Gerald dialed 911. The 911 dispatcher answered on the second ring, and Gerald gave her what she needed in the compressed, sequenced way of a man who understood how emergency information had to be structured to be acted on quickly. His name, his location, the child's name and age, the custody situation as Noah had described it, the woman's position 40 feet away, and the fact that she had seen him find the note and was currently making the calculation that people made when their options were narrowing. He gave the dispatcher the phone number from the note, Daniel Cassidy, Noah's father, and he said, "I need someone to call that number simultaneously with your response units, because this child has been separated from his father since July, and his father needs to know he's been found." The dispatcher said units were 4 minutes out, and that she was flagging the father's number for immediate contact. Gerald thanked her and ended the call and put his phone in his vest pocket and looked at Noah. The boy was still standing in the same position, backpack now hanging from Gerald's hand rather than his own shoulders, and he was doing the thing Gerald had noticed from the beginning, monitoring Linda's position with the peripheral precision of someone who had been practicing it for 11 weeks. He had not moved closer to Gerald or further from him. He had not made himself conspicuous. He was holding his own weight in the situation, with a stillness that belonged in a person 3 times his age, and that in a 7-year-old was both remarkable and terrible. Remarkable because of what it demonstrated about his capability, and terrible because of what it demonstrated about his education, what he had been required to learn, and why. Gerald crouched back down. He kept his voice at the same quiet register he'd used from the beginning. "You've been very smart about this," he said. "The note was exactly right. You did exactly the right thing." Noah looked at him. "Is she going to take me?" he said. "Not while I'm here," Gerald said, "and there are police coming." 4 minutes. Noah processed this. His jaw moved slightly, a small internal adjustment, the recalibration of a child who has been carrying a weight and has just been told that some of it is being transferred. He said, "She's going to say she's allowed to have me. She's going to say it's a family thing and she's my aunt and everything's fine." Gerald said, "Let her say it. That's what the police are for." Noah looked at Gerald's vest, the Sonoran iron patch, the Arizona rocker, the various pins and designations that mapped 8 years of club membership. He said, "Are you a policeman?" "Used to be," Gerald said. "School resource officer for 11 years. Noah considered this. "What's that?" "A police officer who works in schools. I helped kids who needed help." Noah looked at him steadily. "You're good at it," he said, with the flat certainty of a child reporting an observed fact. Gerald said, "I try to be." He paused. "Can you tell me about July? What happened the day your aunt picked you up?" Noah told him in the same efficient sequential way he had communicated everything else, like someone who had organized the information and rehearsed its delivery because he understood that clarity was his most useful tool. It was the 3rd Tuesday of July, a school day, though they were in summer session for reading enrichment, which Noah explained with a brief parenthetical, "I'm good at math, but reading is harder," that Gerald found both heartbreaking and completely beside the point, and also somehow central to everything about this child. His father dropped him at school at 7:45, as he always did. His father always picked him up at 2:30, as he always did. At 2:15, Linda had appeared at the school entrance and told the office staff that there had been a family emergency, and she was authorized to pick up Noah and had a note from his father. The note was not from his father. Gerald did not say this. He let Noah continue. The school had called the number on file. The number on file was his father's cell phone. Linda had his father's cell phone. Gerald did not ask how she had come to have it. He let Noah continue. They had let her take him. She drove him to a house in a part of town he didn't know. And then 2 days later they drove for a very long time, and he had slept in the car. And when he woke up they were in another state, he thought, because the license plates on the cars around them were different colors. He had not had access to a phone. He had not been allowed to contact his father. When he asked about his father, Linda said his father knew where he was and had agreed to this arrangement, and that Noah needed to stop asking because it was upsetting her. Noah had known this was not true because of the call rule. "Dad always calls me before anything changes. He always calls me first." He said it the second time with the same emphasis he'd used the first time, like it was a principle important enough to repeat. He had started making the note 4 weeks into the arrangement. He had stolen a pen from Linda's purse and written it on the back of a piece of junk mail he had found in a recycling bin. And he had revised it twice, quietly, when Linda was in other rooms because the first version had not been clear enough and the second version had been too long. And he had understood with the instinct of someone operating in a constrained environment that the note needed to be short enough to be read quickly and clear enough to be acted on immediately. The third version was the one Gerald had found. He had tried to give it to people 6 times, a woman at a grocery store who had smiled at him and then turned away before he could speak, a man at a park who had listened for 30 seconds and then said something to Linda that Noah couldn't hear, and then walked away, a teenager at a fast food counter who had looked at the note and then looked at Linda and then looked back at the note and said something about not wanting to get involved in family stuff. 2 attempts at other bus stops where Linda had been too close and too watchful for Noah to separate himself from her, enough to speak privately to anyone. And once, 8 days ago, a woman at a laundromat who had taken the note and read it and said she would call and had taken Noah's hand for a moment in a way that felt like she meant it. And then Linda had appeared from behind a row of machines with the pleasant, reasonable face fully deployed and had said something about Noah having an active imagination and a history of this kind of thing. And the woman had looked at Linda and then at Noah and then at the note in her hand and had given it back. Given it back. Gerald absorbed this. He kept his face neutral with the effort of a man who had reasons for strong feeling that he was not going to express in front of a 7-year-old who needed steadiness from him right now, not reaction. He said, 8 days ago at the laundromat. That was the last time before today. Noah nodded. I ran out of notes. I had to make another one. I only got the chance 2 days ago. Gerald looked at this boy. 7 years old. 11 weeks in an unauthorized arrangement in an unknown location, separated from his father, without a phone, with an adult who had constructed a plausible alternative narrative around him the way some adults knew how to do. Making notes from stolen pens and recycled paper and revising them for clarity and trying 6 times and being failed 6 times, and on the 7th time, standing at a bus stop with a woman 40 feet away who was watching him and finding the largest available person and saying, "Check my backpack. Please, mister." In a voice calibrated to carry exactly far enough and no further. Gerald became aware that the teenage girls with the shared earbuds had moved slightly, angling themselves in the way that people angled themselves when they understood that something was happening and had not yet decided what role to play in it. The retired man with the canvas shopping bag was looking at Gerald and Noah with the focused attention of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize a situation that required witnesses. The young woman with the stroller had moved her stroller slightly, a small repositioning that put her between the bus stop and the direction of Linda's approach, which Gerald noted with appreciation because it was not an accident. Linda was moving. She had made her calculation, and she had arrived at a conclusion, and she was walking toward them now with the measured pace of someone who was not hurrying, because hurrying would look wrong, but who was covering the 40 feet with a purpose that her pleasant expression was working hard to contradict. She was smiling. It was a warm, concerned, grandmother-adjacent smile, the smile of a woman who was about to explain something that had been misunderstood and who was confident in her ability to explain it. Gerald stood to his full height. He was 5'11" and broad, and the vest did what vests did in terms of the information it communicated about the person wearing it, which was that this was a man who belonged to something larger than himself and who had the particular settled quality of someone who was not going to be moved from his current position by social pressure or a pleasant smile. Linda stopped 4 feet away. She looked at Noah with the warm, concerned expression fully deployed. "Sweetheart," she said, "I was worried about you. Who's your friend?" Gerald said, "I'm Gerald Fuentes. I'm with the Sonoran Iron MC. I'm also a former law enforcement officer." He said it plainly, not aggressively, the way you stated a fact that was relevant and that the other person needed to have. "I've called 911. There are units on the way. I'd like you to stay where you are until they arrive." Linda's smile adjusted slightly, recalibrating for a new variable. She looked at Noah with an expression that was now also slightly reproving, the expression of an adult who was disappointed in a child's behavior while still maintaining concern for their well-being. "Noah," she said, "have you been telling stories again?" She looked at Gerald. "He does this sometimes. His therapist says it's a way of processing anxiety. He creates narratives that feel very real to him." "I should have mentioned it to you, sweetheart," she said to Noah, "so that you wouldn't worry your new friend." Noah looked at Gerald. His expression said nothing. He had apparently been through this particular move before and had learned not to respond to it in ways that could be used against him. Gerald said, "The police will sort out what's true and what isn't. Until they get here, I'm going to ask you to stay where you are." Linda's pleasant expression developed an edge that she managed quickly and professionally. "I'm his legal guardian," she said. "I have documentation." Gerald said, "You can share that with the officers." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at Noah. She looked at the retired man with the canvas bag who was watching the exchange with open attention. She looked at the young woman with the stroller who had her phone out. She made a calculation that was visible in the brief tightening around her eyes, and then she made another expression, softer, more injured, the expression of a woman being treated unreasonably. "I understand you're trying to help," she said to Gerald, "and that's a good instinct. But this is a family situation, and it's more complicated than it looks. Noah's father and I have had some disagreements about his care, and Noah has been caught in the middle of that, and sometimes he says things that reflect his confusion more than the actual situation." She looked at Noah with warm sadness. "I know this is hard, sweetheart. I know you miss your dad. We're working on getting you back to him soon." Noah said nothing. He stood beside Gerald and said absolutely nothing, and the nothing he said was more articulate than anything he could have put into words because it was the nothing of a child who had heard this speech before and had stopped engaging with it because engaging with it was not useful. If you've ever been in a situation where someone was systematically reframing your accurate perception of reality, where your truth was being translated into confusion or instability by someone with more social currency than you, like this video and subscribe to this channel. We upload a new story every single day because we believe that the people who are hardest to hear deserve the loudest amplification. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that children's voices matter. Gerald heard the sirens before he saw the units. 2 Tucson PD cruisers turning onto Madera from the east, their lights on, and a third unit coming from the opposite direction. The Route 12 bus, which had apparently decided to be on time for once in its operational history, pulled to the stop simultaneously and then assessed the situation and pulled forward 10 feet and waited with the patient uncertainty of public transit encountering an unexpected variable. The officers were out of their vehicles before the cruisers fully stopped. Gerald identified himself immediately. Name, former affiliation, Sonoran Iron MC, and gave the lead officer, a woman named Reyes with the focused efficiency of someone who had been briefed in transit, the folded note and the photograph from the backpack. Reyes read the note in 15 seconds and looked at Noah and said, "Is your name Noah Cassidy?" Noah said yes. Reyes said, "Your dad is on his way. He's driving from Flagstaff right now. He's going to be here in about 3 hours. Noah looked at her. "You called him." "We called him," she said. "He's already in his car. He asked me to tell you that he loves you and that he's coming as fast as he can and that you should eat something if you're hungry." Noah's face did something then that it had not done at any point in the preceding 15 minutes. It stopped working, not in a bad way. It stopped the effortful management and the careful monitoring and the controlled calibration of expression that it had been doing since Gerald first became aware of the boy standing beside him, and it became simply the face of a 7-year-old who had just been told that his father knew where he was and was coming. His eyes filled, and he blinked, and 2 tears ran down, and he wiped them with the sleeve of his white shirt, with a gesture that was so unconsciously childlike, so unguarded, that it was like watching something that had been braced against pressure for a very long time, finally allowed to be what it actually was. Gerald put his hand on Noah's shoulder. He kept it there. Linda was speaking to the second officer. Her voice had shifted registers, less warm, more precise, the voice of someone who had moved from social management to legal management and was now citing documentation and prior arrangements and the complexity of family law and the ways in which well-meaning bystanders could misinterpret situations they didn't fully understand. The officer was listening with the expression of someone taking in information that they were going to verify rather than accept, and was asking for identification and documentation with the polite implacability of someone who had been trained to do exactly this. Gerald stayed with Noah. That was his job right now. Everything else was being handled by people equipped to handle it. His job was the boy. He said to Noah, "You said you tried 6 times. Noah wiped his face again with the sleeve. "Yes. That's a lot of times to try something that kept not working." Noah thought about this. "I knew it would work eventually," he said. "Dad always says if something is right, you keep trying until it works. He said a wrong outcome doesn't mean a wrong approach. It might just mean you haven't found the right person yet." Gerald looked at this 7-year-old who had his father's brown eyes and his father's apparent gift for clear thinking, and who had spent 11 weeks alone in a difficult situation, metabolizing his father's advice into a survival strategy and executing it with a precision that most adults would not have managed. "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Gerald said. "He is," Noah said. "He's really smart. He's an engineer. He designs bridges. He says bridges work because all the weight is shared across the whole structure. If one part takes too much weight, it fails. That's why bridges need lots of parts." Gerald looked at the boy. He said, "Is that why you came to me?" Noah considered this with the grave thoughtfulness that had characterized all of his considerations. "I needed someone to share the weight," he said. "It was too heavy for just me." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You found the right person." Noah looked up at him. "I knew you were right because you were paying attention," he said. "The other people I tried were looking at their phones or looking somewhere else. You were just standing there watching everything." He paused. "My teacher says the people worth talking to are the ones who are already listening." Gerald thought about 11 years as a school resource officer, about the specific quality of presence that work had required, the being there-ness of standing in a school hallway and being genuinely available to whatever needed to come to you, not performing availability, but actually having it. He thought about how he had carried that quality into the MC and into the community work and into the ordinary days of standing at bus stops waiting for routes that ran late. He thought about the fact that he had almost taken his truck to the mechanic the day before and had not, because a part had been delayed, which had put him at this bus stop at this time on this Wednesday. And he understood that this kind of thinking could go in circles that led nowhere useful, so he stopped and came back to the boy beside him. The Route 12 bus had given up waiting and had pulled away. The 2 teenage girls had not left. They were standing near the bench, and one of them was on her phone, and Gerald could see from the way she was holding it that she was taking photographs, not of anything intrusive, just of the scene, the officers and the cruisers and the bus stop in the afternoon light, the kind of documentation that young people performed instinctively in significant moments. The retired man with the canvas bag had set it down and was talking to the young woman with the stroller in the low tones of people processing something they have witnessed together. Linda was being walked to one of the cruisers. Her pleasant expression had not fully left her face, but it had become a different kind of pleasant, more careful and less warm, the expression of a person marshaling resources. Reyes came back to Gerald and Noah. She crouched down to Noah's level with the easy practice of someone who did this regularly and did it right. She said, "Noah, we're going to take you somewhere comfortable to wait for your dad. Is that okay?" Noah said, "Can Gerald come?" Reyes looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at Noah. He said, "I'll come for a while. Until you're settled." Noah nodded. He reached over and took the strap of his backpack from Gerald's hand and put it over his own shoulder, both hands gripping the straps the way he'd been holding them when Gerald first noticed him. And then he looked up at Gerald and said, "Thank you for checking." Gerald said, "Thank you for asking." Noah looked at him for a moment with those steady brown eyes. Then he said, "I knew you would. I watched you for a few minutes before I came over. You looked at everyone at the bus stop when you arrived. Most people just look at their phones. You looked at people." He paused. "I thought that meant you were the kind of person who would see things right." Gerald had no response to this that was adequate to what the statement deserved, so he said nothing and put his hand briefly on the back of the boy's head in the way that felt right, and they walked together toward the cruiser in the late afternoon light. The large man in the leather vest and the small boy with the new backpack and the stolen pen note in his front pocket, and 11 weeks of carried weight that was, finally, beginning to be set down. The Tucson Police Department's Family Services Unit operated out of a building on the south side that had been designed with the specific understanding that the people who came into it were often in the most disorienting moments of their lives and needed the environment to communicate something other than institutional indifference. There were plants in the waiting area. The lighting was warm rather than fluorescent. The chairs were the kind you could actually sit in rather than endure. Someone had put a small basket of individually wrapped crackers and juice boxes on the table near the window, and Noah looked at this basket for a moment when they arrived with the expression of someone who has just remembered that hunger is a thing that exists. And Reyes said, "Go ahead." And he took a juice box and crackers and sat in one of the chairs and ate with the methodical focus of someone fueling for the next phase of a long operation. Gerald sat beside him. He had called Boone, the Sonoran Iron's vice president, from the cruiser. A brief call to explain his whereabouts and delay and the reason for it. And Boone had said what Boone always said in these situations, which was a single word indicating comprehension, followed by the question of what was needed. And Gerald had said, "Just to know where I am." And Boone had said, "Understood," and ended the call. The truck and the transmission could wait another day. There were things that could wait and things that couldn't, and Gerald had made this triage his entire adult life and had never found it particularly complicated. Reyes gave him a briefing in the hallway, while a family services advocate named Carmen sat with Noah and asked him careful questions in a voice that was warm without being performative about its warmth. Linda Cassidy had been detained for questioning. The documentation she had produced was being verified. Preliminary checks had flagged an active missing persons report filed by Daniel Cassidy on July 18th, 2 days after Noah had disappeared from school, and a family court order establishing sole physical custody with Daniel Cassidy pending a hearing that had been scheduled for the previous month and at which Linda Cassidy had not appeared. The situation was, as these situations often were, both simpler and more complicated than it looked on the surface. Simpler because the legal architecture was clear and in Daniel's favor. More complicated because 11 weeks of a child's life had been lived in the space between what the law said and what had actually happened, and that space had a cost that would take time to fully understand. Gerald thanked Reyes and went back to sit with Noah, who had finished the juice box and the crackers and was looking at the basket to see if there was anything else that merited consideration. There were more crackers. He took another pack and opened it with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to assume abundance. Carmen excused herself after a few minutes, noting something briefly in her folder, and Gerald and Noah sat in the warm-lit waiting room with the plants and the chairs and the particular quiet of a place where difficult things were being processed at a pace that was slower than the people inside it sometimes wanted. Noah said, "How far is Flagstaff from here?" "About 2.5 hours, Gerald said. "Maybe less the way your dad is probably driving." Noah considered this. He said, "When I was little, I used to get scared during thunderstorms. Not really little. Like 4. He paused. Dad used to count the seconds between the lightning and the thunder. He said every 5 seconds was 1 mile. So we'd count together and figure out how far away the storm was. He said knowing the distance makes the thing less scary because then it's not just big and dark. It's a number. It's a number you can watch get smaller." Gerald looked at this boy who was 7 years old and had been alone in a difficult situation for 11 weeks and was now sitting in a family services waiting room doing arithmetic on his father's location as a way of managing the last hours of a very long wait. He said, "So right now your dad is about how far?" Noah thought about it. "Maybe 30 lightning bolts away," he said, "and every minute the number goes down." Gerald said, "That's a good way to think about it." Noah ate a cracker. He said, "She told me he didn't want me." "Linda, she said that he had agreed to let her take me because he was too busy with work and I was difficult, and he needed a break." She said it a lot of times. She said it in different ways. She said once that he had called her and asked her to keep me longer because things were complicated at home. Gerald said nothing. He let the boy continue. Noah said, "I didn't believe her, not even the first time, because of the call rule. If any of that was true, he would have called me first. He always calls me first." She couldn't explain why he hadn't called. She said his phone was broken, then she said I was confused about what the rule was, then she said the rule didn't apply in special circumstances. He paused. When a story keeps changing, it means it's not true. Dad taught me that too. Gerald thought about Daniel Cassidy, this engineer who designed bridges and understood distributed weight and taught his 7-year-old son that changing stories meant false ones and that knowing the distance to a storm made it less frightening. He thought about what kind of person produced a child like this, what quality of attention and intention went into raising a boy who could spend 11 weeks in an unauthorized arrangement, isolated and without resources, and respond by making notes and revising them for clarity, and trying 6 times, and staying calm, and choosing his moment with the patience of someone who understood that timing was part of the strategy. He said, "Your dad's going to be real glad to see you." Noah said, "I know. He's going to cry. He cries when things matter a lot. He says that's what tears are for." He said it quietly and precisely, like he was repeating something he had committed to memory because it was important, and he wanted to be able to find it whenever he needed it. Gerald had been in law enforcement and then in MC community work for a combined total of nearly 2 decades, and he had developed over that time a specific and reliable resistance to being undone in public by the things he witnessed, a professional membrane that allowed him to be present in difficult moments without losing the steadiness those moments required. He was aware, sitting in that waiting area with Noah Cassidy, that the membrane was doing more work than usual and that it was succeeding, but only just. He said, "After your dad gets here and everything is sorted out, will you go back to Flagstaff?" Noah nodded. "That's where we live. We have an apartment with a view of the mountains. Dad says on clear days you can see almost 100 miles. He paused. "I've been thinking about that view for 11 weeks. 100 miles of mountain view," Gerald said. Noah said, "and my own bed, and Dad's cooking. He's not a great cook, but he tries really hard, and I don't tell him when things don't taste right, because trying hard matters more than being good at something right away." He said this with the earnest moral conviction of a child who had absorbed a lesson and believed in it completely. Gerald said, "That's a generous way to think about cooking." Noah said, "Dad says generosity is a skill you practice, like any other skill. You're not born generous. You get generous by choosing it enough times that it becomes automatic." He looked at Gerald. "Is that true?" Gerald thought about it honestly. "I think so," he said. "I think most of the good things are like that. You choose them enough times and they become who you are." Noah looked at him. "Is that why you helped me?" "Because you practiced it enough that it was automatic." Gerald thought about 11 years in school hallways, about 8 years with the Sonoran Iron, about a house he'd grown up in that had taught him early what it meant to need someone to pay attention and have them look away instead. He thought about all of it as a long practice of a specific thing, the choice to stay present to what was actually in front of him, to not let the ordinary day make him blind to the extraordinary moment inside it. He said, "I think so. I think I've been practicing it for a long time." Noah nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'm going to practice it too." "When I grow up?" Gerald looked at him. "I think you've already started," he said. They waited. The afternoon moved toward evening. Carmen brought more juice boxes and a sandwich that Noah ate with focused appreciation. Reyes checked in twice with updates that were procedural and positive, the verification moving in the right direction, the documentation holding up, Linda Cassidy's account of the situation failing to align with the documented record in ways that were becoming increasingly relevant. Gerald called his mechanic and rescheduled for the following day, and the mechanic, who had known Gerald for 12 years and understood the general shape of Gerald's life, asked no questions and said he'd see him tomorrow. At 6:47 in the evening, Gerald heard the doors. He heard them before Noah did because he was facing them, and Noah was facing the window where the light had gone from afternoon gold to evening blue over the course of their wait. He heard the doors open, and he heard footsteps that had the specific quality of footsteps moving as fast as they could without running, because running in a police building felt wrong, but every other speed felt insufficient. He said, "Noah." The boy turned. Daniel Cassidy was 36 years old and had his son's brown eyes and the look of a man who had been in a car for 2.5 hours running on the particular fuel that hope and terror produced in combination. He was still in his work clothes, a collared shirt and dark pants, and his hair was not entirely in order, and he had not stopped to address any of that because none of it mattered at all. He came through the waiting room doorway, and he saw his son, and he stopped for 1 full second, the way people stop when the thing they have been moving toward for 11 weeks is suddenly simply there, requiring no more movement, requiring only receiving. Noah said, "Dad," and then he was across the room. Daniel caught him and lifted him in a single motion that was both careful and desperate, the way you held something that had been lost and was fragile, and was also the most important thing. And Noah's arms went around his father's neck and his legs around his waist, and he pressed his face into his father's shoulder, and Daniel pressed his face into his son's hair, and they held each other in the waiting room with the plants and the warm lights. While Carmen looked at her folder, and Reyes looked at the door, and Gerald looked at the window where the evening was settling over the city in shades of blue and amber. Daniel was crying. He made no effort to manage it or minimize it. The tears came, and he let them come because that was what tears were for. His son had known this and had been right about it, and he held Noah and cried into his hair and said his name several times in the way that people said the names of things they had been afraid of losing. After a while, Noah leaned back enough to look at his father's face. He looked at the tears with the expression of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. He said, "I knew you'd cry." Daniel laughed through the crying, the specific sound of simultaneous grief and relief and love that had nowhere else to go. He said, "Of course I'm crying. You've been gone for 11 weeks, Noah said. 43 lightning bolts. I counted on the way here, from Flagstaff." Daniel looked at his son. He said, "You counted." "I knew the distance," Noah said. "Knowing the distance makes the thing less scary." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were still wet, but his face had changed. The desperation in it converted into something steadier, the expression of a man who was on the other side of the worst thing and was beginning to understand what the other side felt like. He looked over Noah's shoulder and found Gerald. Carmen had told him on the phone, in the brief call when Daniel was already an hour into the drive, that a member of the Sonoran Iron MC had been the one to respond to Noah at the bus stop. Daniel looked at Gerald now with the look of a man for whom words were not currently an adequate instrument. Gerald stood. Daniel shifted Noah to one arm, the practiced ease of a father accustomed to carrying a child on his hip, and extended his free hand. Gerald took it, and they shook, and Daniel held the shake for a moment longer than a handshake usually lasted because he needed to, and Gerald understood that, and let him. Daniel said, "He told you about the note." Gerald said, "He did. He revised it 3 times. The final version was very clear." Daniel looked at his son. "You revised it?" Noah said, "The first version wasn't concise enough." Gerald said the word concise like it was familiar, like the boy had used it before, which he had because his father used it, because his father was an engineer who understood that clarity of communication was load-bearing in the same way that the structural elements of a bridge were load-bearing. And he had passed this understanding to his son in the way that parents passed things to children, through repetition and example, and the daily practice of living with someone until their way of seeing became part of how you saw. Daniel said, "That's my boy." Noah said, "Gerald helped. He sat with me the whole time." Daniel looked at Gerald again. Gerald said, "He didn't need much from me. He'd already done the hard part." "That's not true," Noah said, with the directness that had characterized everything he'd said since the bus stop. "He was the right person. I tried 6 times with wrong people. He was the right one because he was already paying attention." He looked at Gerald with the same steady assessment he'd offered from the beginning. "You should know that. You were the right person." Gerald had been told he had done a good thing many times over the course of his career, by supervisors and parents and community members and the various people who found reason to say it. He had received those statements with the professional grace appropriate to them. What Noah Cassidy said to him in the family services waiting room in Tucson on a Wednesday evening in late September landed somewhere different, in a place below the professional and above the personal, in the specific register of things that were simply true and that would stay true for a very long time. He said, "Thank you for trusting me with it." Noah nodded, satisfied, and tucked his face back against his father's shoulder. The Sonoran Iron MC established something in the months after that Wednesday. Gerald brought the proposal to the club's monthly meeting with the directness that had always characterized his contributions to club business. A child had spent 11 weeks trying to give a note to the right person and had tried 6 times before finding one, and the question the club needed to ask itself was what could be done to increase the odds that the right person was findable. The club developed a public awareness program in partnership with Tucson PD's Community Liaison Office, training sessions open to the public on how to recognize when a child was attempting to communicate distress, what signs to look for, how to respond in ways that kept the child safe and the situation from escalating, and how to involve authorities appropriately when something was wrong. They ran the sessions quarterly at the East Side Clubhouse and at 3 community centers and at 2 schools whose principals had heard about Noah Cassidy and had called Gerald directly. They called the program Already Listening, which was not a formal name exactly, more a description of what it asked of people. To already be listening when they walked into a room, to not wait for something dramatic before they paid attention, to understand that the children who needed help most were often the ones who were quietest about needing it, who had learned through hard experience to calibrate their requests to the minimum viable volume, to find the one person in a bus stop who was already watching and to trust that person with something that had been carried alone for too long. Daniel Cassidy brought Noah to the Sonoran Iron Clubhouse 6 weeks after the bus stop. Noah was wearing a shirt that was slightly too big that had a diagram of a suspension bridge on it, and he carried canyon-adjacent energy in the way he moved through the space, taking in the bikes and the photos on the walls and the various assembled members with the same methodical assessment he applied to everything. He shook hands with the members he was introduced to and asked each of them a question that was specific to something he had observed about them, the kind of social attentiveness that made the recipient feel accurately seen. When he got to Gerald, he said, "This is where you all plan things." Gerald said, "This is where we meet, yeah." Noah looked around the room. He said, "My dad says organizations work best when the people in them trust each other. That's why bridges are strong, not because of any one part, but because of how the parts are connected." Gerald said, "Your dad's a smart man." "He is," Noah said. He said it the same way he'd said it at the bus stop, with simple, uncomplicated pride, the pride of a child in a parent who has earned it. Daniel stood nearby talking to Boone about bridges, which turned out to be a subject Boone had opinions about, and the conversation had taken on the animated quality of 2 people discovering unexpected common ground, which was a thing Gerald had watched happen at the clubhouse many times, and which never stopped being one of his favorite things about the space, the way it generated unexpected connections between people who had no reason to know each other and then did. Gerald looked at Noah. He said, "You doing okay? Since everything." Noah thought about it with his usual visible care. "I'm in counseling," he said. "The counselor says I processed things in an unusually organized way, and that this is both a strength and something to pay attention to. She says sometimes very organized processing is a way of not feeling things, and that I should make sure I also feel things and not just organize them." Gerald said, "That sounds like good advice." Noah said, "I cried twice last week. Once when Dad made dinner and it wasn't very good, but he'd tried really hard, and once when I found a drawing I'd made at school before July. It was a bridge." He paused. "I showed it to the counselor and she said that was feeling things, so I think I'm getting better at it." Because that was the truth, wasn't it? That the capacity to organize fear into action, to make notes and revise them and try 6 times without giving up, was a form of strength that also needed its counterpart, the capacity to feel the thing itself when the danger had passed. The children who carried too much alone for too long needed not just rescue, but the slower work of learning to set the weight down, to feel the relief of the ground without it. That the bridge metaphor that ran through Noah's understanding of things was right in ways his 7-year-old mind couldn't yet fully articulate. That what made structures hold was not any single element of exceptional strength, but the distribution of load across connected parts, and that what had finally held for Noah at that bus stop was exactly that. A 7-year-old and a biker and a folded note and a juice box and a warm-lit room and a father driving 2.5 hours counting lightning bolts, all of it connected, all of it load-bearing, all of it part of the bridge that brought him home. The Sonoran Iron MC added a line to their community mission statement after that year. It read simply, "We are already listening," which was both a commitment and an instruction, a thing they asked of themselves, and, implicitly, of everyone who heard the story of a boy at a bus stop who had learned to find the person who was already paying attention, and who had been right that such a person existed, and who had been right that asking was worth it, and who had been right about all of it in the quiet, organized 11 weeks of practice way he was right about most things. A child who had distributed his weight across the one available connection and found that it held. Gerald kept one thing from that Wednesday. Not the note, which was evidence and had remained with the case file. Not a photograph or a document. He kept the memory of what Noah had said at the bus stop, before the police arrived and before the weight began to lift, when it was just the two of them at the bench with the city moving around them and the woman in the gray cardigan making her calculation 40 feet away. You looked at everyone at the bus stop when you arrived. Most people just look at their phones. You looked at people. I thought that meant you were the kind of person who would see things right. He thought about it on bus rides. He thought about it in meetings and at community events and on the long straight roads where the high desert opened out around him and there was nothing to do but ride and think. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who looked at people, who was already listening, who had practiced presence long enough that it had become automatic, and about the specific consequence of that practice on one Wednesday afternoon when a boy with a folded note in his front pocket had scanned a bus stop for the right person and found one. And he thought about the 6 people before him, about the grocery store and the park and the fast food counter and the laundromat, about the woman who had taken the note and given it back. And he thought about what it cost a child to try 6 times and fail and make a new note and try again. He thought about that cost not as an abstraction, but as a specific weight carried by a specific boy with his father's brown eyes and his father's clear thinking. And he let himself feel the full dimension of it, because Noah's counselor was right that feeling things mattered and that organizing them into usefulness was not the same as experiencing them. Then he let it become what it needed to become, which was not guilt or grief, but purpose. The thing that had happened was done, and good. The thing that needed doing was to make the next child's 6th attempt unnecessary, to make the first attempt enough, to fill the world, or at least the corner of it that the Sonoran Iron MC occupied, with people who were already listening. Thank you for watching this story. If it reminded you that children asking for help don't always use words, that the quietest requests are sometimes the ones that cost the most courage to make, and that being the kind of person who is already paying attention is something you can choose and practice until it becomes who you are, please share this video. Subscribe to this channel because we upload a new story every single day. Stories about people who looked up from their phones and saw something that mattered, who sat down when sitting down was what was needed, who were already listening when someone needed to be heard. Tell us in the comments where you watch this from and what time it is there. Our community is everywhere, and every single one of you who stayed until the end is proof that the right people exist, that they're out there, that when a child scans a room for the person who is already watching, there is someone there to find.